Okay. Okay, ready? Okay. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's workshop. Thank you for coming, taking time out of your busy days and evenings to join us. My name is Steve Ratke. I'm the city's planning manager. And I'd like to give you a bit of a brief overview of what we're going to do tonight. And then we'll talk a little bit about the presentation, and I'll turn it over to our consulting team. Well, just a brief overview in the form of California has changed its housing laws a few years ago pertaining to what are called objective design standards. And going forward, cities like Westminster throughout California can no longer apply their subjective development standards as they pertain to multifamily residential and mixed-use projects. So one of the things that we need to do, like other cities in California, is update our development standards as they pertain to multifamily residential and mixed-use development. A little bit of a background is the city did receive a grant from SCAG, Southern California Association of Governments, to prepare these objective design standards. The objective design standards are a component of a zoning code update. So purpose of this workshop tonight is to gather comments, all the input that you might have to help us prepare a draft of the objective design standards that will be part of our zoning code update. So we appreciate all the comments that you can give us. And we're going to have a presentation in a couple of minutes, which I'd like to introduce all the folks who have made this workshop possible. The first, of course, is the planning staff, which includes Alice, and Sandy, and Jarfa, and Stephen are here, along with myself. And I'd also like to introduce our consultants from Crambula, Ambarbula and Associates. That's Don and Jonathan. They're going to be providing a presentation momentarily. And I'd also like to indicate that we have translation available after the presentation that you'll have in just a moment. We have Kit, who will provide Vietnamese translation, and we have Stephen, who's outside right now, who can provide Spanish language translation. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Don. Thank you, Don.
Hey, thanks, Steve. Again, I'm Don Arambula, and I'm joined by Jonathan Conkle. We're Crandall Arambula. We were selected to do not only this ODS project, but also 4 others in Southern California. We're from Portland, and I've got a pretty good history here. I went to school in UCLA, and I lived here for quite a while, and so I have a sense of things. And we're really pleased to be working here with you. We work on ODS around North America. My firm is celebrating its 25th anniversary. So that means we've got a lot of experience, but that doesn't necessarily mean we know everything. And so the reason we're here is to make sure that this reflects your values and your concerns that you want to have for your community, because it's important to do that. So with that, let me just go through a series of slides. It's going to take about 20 minutes. I hope it's somewhat entertaining as well. And can you hear me? I feel like I'm getting a lot of feedback. I feel like I'm, okay, very good. All right, so I'd like to just hold the questions until I get through the presentation, and then we'll have some clarification questions. And then we've got a comment card, Jonathan, or you should all have that on your table. If you don't, get one, because your comments matter. So this isn't a punch list meeting where people just take the information and it goes in a back door or in a trash can somewhere. We will report back to you in a future meeting what the comments were and how we're going to use those. So we take this to heart. All right, so with that, let's just get going. So what are objective development standards, or you can call it design standards, or objective design and development standards? It really has been required by the state legislature, and the rationale for it is to address the housing crisis that all of us here in California are seeing today. And so there are a couple of ways that you can superheat the development of housing. That is provide what we call certainty in adopted ODS, essentially identifying the rules of the game. So the developer, the community, the residents all know what is expected from a development submittal. And then this other part of this is faster permitting. So often, the process takes a long time. So are there anything that could be done to cut the permitting period so that you get more housing quicker? So the next question is, why do we need objective development standards? Well, the problem is today, there is nothing to evaluate projects in an objective way. So what the city has today is a series of subjective design guidelines or just limited amount of code. That is very, very ambiguous. It is recommendations. It's discretionary. You can do this. You might want to do that. But it isn't something that has the force of law. And as a result of that, that subjectivity often results in inconsistent interpretations because it's a he said, she said, my idea, your idea, I don't know. Let's talk about it. So it becomes very much a iterative process, if you will. And as a result of that, prolongs the process. So we want to get away from recommendations and subjectivity and create development standards that are objective, that offer no gray area. It's black and white. Either you do it or you don't. And these requirements are shalls and musts. And they need to be measurable and verifiable. So there are dimensions, there's heights, there's width, there's colors, there's materials, those sorts of things that are part of that. And the idea here is not to layer more regulations, but to distill this down to the fundamental things that are required and then allow some flexibility where it doesn't matter. Because just by adding more and more regulation doesn't make anything better. So we need to find what are the essential things that you want to regulate and allow flexibility for everything else. All right, so where will these standards apply? Well, first of all, it's not going to apply to single-family homes. Residential development that is already there. It's not a remodel project. It's for new development only. So if it's a new project in the MU, which is mixed use 36, and MU 40, mixed use zone parcels, and those are mostly along your major corridors, Beach Boulevard, Westminster Boulevard, Trask, the other bigger roadways. So where most of that is targeted. And then there's also standards that are going to apply to your R2, 3, 4, and 5 zones. So those are your townhomes, you've got condominiums, and maybe some small apartments that are mostly infill into your neighborhoods. There might be some as part of the corridors, but generally they are in the neighborhoods, all right? And so what we want to make sure is those in particular are good neighbors so that they take in consideration the context that they have along those residential streets. So what are the benefits? So there are good things that come out of this. So for the developers, the development application review process will be streamlined. As we said before, we're going to cut that back. And as a result of that, because we're architects and we work with developers, we know that when we sign a contract, one of the things that we have to figure out is, what's our fee? And if there's no certainty, our tendency is to charge more, simply because we got to build in this redundancy of meeting again and again because we don't want to lose money. So that, as a result, increases the cost of housing because they'll pass that on, the developer will pass that on to the project. And so that money saved will reduce with the processing time will be helpful. The other one is there's no moving target. So if I'm an architect and I represented my builder or my developer, I know what those standards are and they're clear, concise, and easy to understand. So I know what to do and what to respond to. And finally, as we said before, there's less red tape. And because this development process will be done at a staff level. It won't be done by the Planning Commission. It won't be done by City Council. And this is by mandate from state law. All right? So what do the residents get out of this? Well, first of all, the biggest benefit, you're going to have more housing choices. And so that is a fabulous thing to do. And because you're involved in the process, you have the chance to weigh in on what the values of design should be. So you get the predictability of design that are based on the community's values. They're not imported from Portland or Pittsburgh or some other place. They reflect what the residents of Westminster want. And then there are other small things, like we call public accessible amenities. Wider sidewalks, more street trees, more benches, better lighting, and other things like that that might be part of the development as part of the standards. And then, because we have a lot of mixed-use development, we want to set the stage so that the development, if it has a shop, it has an office building, is economically viable. What we find is a lot of development standards are not. So the requirement, things like ground floor commercial, but it doesn't work, and they end up being what we call a ghost box, retail spaces that no developer can fill, and become a blight. So we don't want to see that kind of thing. So we want to be very cautious about the mixed-use areas, only locating that and requiring it where it will work. All right, enough of that. So let's get into the meat of this. So we've got to create the ODS. So what goes into that objective design and development standards? So here we are. So we're providing input. So we're really kind of the beginning step. So that you see on the left, we've got a contract that started in a year ago. Most of this was gathering information, evaluating existing regulations, having the better sense of the lay of the land. So we've met periodically with Alice and Steve and staff to just kind of get a better sense of what you have in your code, what you have in the design guidelines, so we have a better sense. Once we get into this middle part, which is creating the ODS, what we're talking about today, and we've met with the development review team, who has given us some input on March 15th and 1st, and then we're going to have a series of public meetings. So we're having this meeting tonight. And then we do know on June 17th, a lot of people can't make it on a weeknight. So we're going to have another meeting, and we invite everybody to come again. There's nothing wrong with chiming in twice into a community meeting. So that's going to be 2:30 to 3:30 on June 17th. And then we're also going to have some invited stakeholders, people who have a property, who may express some interest, a developer, an architect, others who are actually going to go through the application process, and we want to talk a little bit about that as well. And also update them what we've heard from the community. And then following that, after the end of June here, as you can see on the timeline, this process, the ODS, is going to be folded into a larger zoning update process. And if you have any specific questions, Steve and Alice can kind of fill you in on that after the meeting, or after we take some questions, you can do that. So they're the experts on how that's going to be done, not me. So let's talk about the standards and how they're going to organize. So we want to, again, this is about clarity. And we want to have concise amount of standards that matter. So there are three areas that we want to have regulations for. And these little cartoons kind of explain it. Number one is the public realm. And that's kind of a planner word. But what it is, it's the sidewalk, the streetscape from the curb line to the property line. In front, around, it's kind of the collar that goes around the building. Where you see in that first diagram, the yellow, it's all of that area, the public area. And what we find is, if you take care of that, you're probably going to be successful with a project. The second piece of this is the site development. And let's think about it as that's the placemat. That, number three, the building goes on top of. So these are broken into three distinct areas with standards that regulate those three areas. The edge, the mat, and the cup and saucer, if you will. So let's talk about those public realm improvements. And this is kind of generally what we're looking at, all right? So this is a street just off of Westminster Boulevard, a side street. And you see, we're imagining, this is not a definite, where you see this is just for instance, if that site were to redevelop, we would expect to see that perimeter, that collar, have these things: widened sidewalks, canopy street trees, shrubs and ground cover, ornamental pedestrian-oriented lights like 15 feet high, lighting the sidewalk, not the roadway, this is for pedestrians, benches, bike racks, and other what we call street furniture, all the things that go along with that. And what we are anticipating, because we want wider sidewalks, the current standards for the city, the sidewalk is very narrow, and frankly, it's substandard. And we'll take a look at why it's substandard. So this will require what we call a public easement. You see this area on the left that's in the darker paved area. And so we're going to ask the developers to allow this area for this perimeter landscaping improvements. In turn, because we're taking some possible development area out of this, through the rezoning process, we want to revisit setbacks so the developers have a larger envelope so the setbacks are less to take into account for this. And we'll show you some examples how that might occur. So let's talk about why it's important to think about the public realm issue. So because this is about multifamily development, and we find the people who are living in multifamily development, this is not only in Westminster but around the country, are the people who may not own a car, may be transit dependent, they may be handicapped, they may be elderly, they may be children, and they're the people who are actually, you want to be able to have them have the ability to walk to a grocery store, to school, to their job, and not fight with everybody else to find a parking space wherever they're going. And they need this. So this is about equity and providing safe walking and rolling access, which is lacking. The public realm standards will address these fundamental needs that people need. So you see, the conditions that we have are not doing that. So that's on your major corridors in particular. And then when we look into the analysis that we've looked into your neighborhood, you've got a lot of gaps in the network today. So there's nothing worse than going by a development and then having to walk through a lawn. Or if you're handicapped, getting to a corner and not having the ability to cross the street or continue and having to take that wheelchair into the street. That is not equitable. You would never design a roadway with these conditions. So we need to rethink how we think about that area so that we're creating safe, direct, and convenient neighborhood sidewalk networks that works for all ages. It's okay to send your 8-year-old to the grocery store to go pick something up. It's okay for your grandparents to get out and get some exercise. These aren't the conditions today that you can have. And incrementally, as you get development, we want to get the development that starts addressing these things. So the other thing that we have to deal with is that you've got very wide roadway corridors. And these are often controlled by Caltrans, and they're essentially highways. So when we've got 6, 7 lanes, that is a pretty tough environment. And so what we want to deal and think about, not so much from the point of view behind a steering wheel, but as somebody walking along these corridors. So we want to think about what are the conditions that you would feel more comfortable in these high traffic conditions. So luckily, you've got some good examples already being built. You've got this wonderful project on Westminster Avenue called Westminster Crossings. And it's an award-winning project, as I understand. And it's done a lot of the things that we would say are good design. So you see here, there's adjacent apartments, there's a busy street, and what they've developed is pedestrian-friendly sidewalks. And so when we think about the pedestrian-friendly sidewalk, we're thinking from that curb line to the building edge. And what we want to have is adequate area for a wide sidewalk. We want to see, as you see this run again and again, street trees, benches, planters, landscaping. So we want to have all those sorts of things that make it pedestrian friendly, and even in better conditions, it would be even better if you had parked cars too. Because that creates that barrier, because when you got 50, 60,000 cars a day, that creates that separation, that creates that comfort and convenience for people. All right, so that's one thing that we want to think about. So those are your busy streets. And then on your neighborhood streets, we want to think about connectivity and access into development. So again, we want a landscape buffer. Maybe the sidewalk gets a little bit narrower. And then you see these townhomes. We want to have good access to front doors. So that is a kind of development scheme that we want. And then we want to create zones. A parkway where the landscaping goes, a sidewalk standards, and what we call a transition area. That little bit of greenway that separates the building and the development from the sidewalk. So you got a buffer on both sides of that. So what do you want to do today? So is it okay, the conditions that you have today? And so the standards shall improve mobility. So mobility is another planner word for meaning the ease of walking and access for residents. So we want to be able to get from point A to B. That's what mobility is. And so generally, based on those images that you saw before, we'd prefer not to have what's currently typically everywhere, what is a curb-adjacent sidewalk. Because the problem is that curb space is a precious commodity. It's the place where you get telephone poles, you get traffic control boxes, you got signs, you got all kinds of infrastructure that are serving the roadway. And so it's a push and shove between all of those sorts of things. And if you can push the sidewalk away from that, you don't get obstructions like you got here. So even the best intended sorts of conditions are not well. So the bus put a bench right in the middle of the sidewalk without thinking, you know, that's great if you're riding a bus, but imagine if you're blind and you walked along this sidewalk. The amount of landmines that you would have to navigate is just incomprehensible. So what we want to have is standards that says, no, you cannot do that, and you do what is on the right. No obstructions. That sidewalk has to be free and clear of no obstructions. And then we want adequate width. So the city's current standards are for a 6-foot sidewalk, generally. There may be some wiggle room here. But as you can see, that's okay to get out your car door, but it certainly doesn't create an environment that you would say is welcoming. What we'd prefer to have is the ability to either pave or put landscaping adjacent to that car zone, but have a wider sidewalk so that people can walk side by side. You know, you got somebody coming the other way. So it's not a substandard way of designing the sidewalk. A little bit more width, an adequate amount, not overdoing it. The other thing we want to think about is obstructions for people walking along the street, and think about things that are fundamental for a development, like a driveway, and think about what the condition is, because it's always, as I know, as I'm always looking at when I put my car in reverse, wondering if there's somebody out there behind me. Inevitably, the more times in the width that you create those danger points, the more times that people are going to have an accident. So we want to minimize those, recognizing that you need to have access, but we want to minimize those crossings for driveways. So those are some just in terms of the public realm. The second piece of this is what we call the public realm transition between the development site and that collar around the edge. So this, the standards here really deal with where you see that dashed line. That's the face, the building face. And we want to concentrate on the first floor in particular. So we don't necessarily need to regulate the whole facade, but in particular, we want to have some standards that deal with, one, privacy, because again, people are living in ground floor units, and livability. So again, remember that busy street, and we're going to talk about that again. So I don't want to be critical of this development, because I think it's a wonderful development, a real positive, because you're getting development here. But the design of this development was really in response to the conditions. You see the little GIF here, the amount of traffic here. So what you would prefer to have as a development, and typically you would have standards that would ask for balconies, terraces, and patios. And a condition like this, with that noise, air pollution, how many people would actually use a balcony terrace here? Probably not many. simply because it's what we'd call hostile. So we want to try to make sure that we're going to avoid requiring things that are not going to work on a corridor like that. The other thing is, well, we want to think about safety, what we call eyes on the street. And typically, you want buildings to either turn a shoulder or face the street. In this case, because of this traffic conditions, they've turned their back to the street. So the entries are on the other side of the building. So again, if we want to activate the sidewalks, get people, shorten the distance to a shopping center or to a job or to school, they got to circle around the development. And there are no front doors here. There are no eyes on the street as well. So that's a safety thing, a surveillance issue. And then picture this. So most units, right, when you go into a residence, you go through the living room, and out back is a bedroom. So if the front door is on the other side, that means the living room are there. So we validated this by looking at the floor plans. So what this building has is all the bedrooms along this edge. And that sidewalk is literally within 4 feet at grade. So if I lived here, I wouldn't leave my windows open. I'd have the blinds down all the time. And so that impacts the livability for those residents at that ground floor. So we need to develop standards that can address these issues. So, because these aren't good conditions. These aren't creating the kind of places that people want to live. So what can we do? So I'm going to give you some examples of what standards could do. So this example is on a very similar busy street. And what we're saying is what we need to do is push that first floor back. And as you see, the upper floor on the building actually goes right up to that sidewalk line so that the developer maintains that envelope of developable areas that you saw before. But you've got the setback, and then you got landscaping, you got a wall, and then maybe if it's okay, maybe a little lower traffic, maybe you have patios at that ground floor. So we'll allow that, not require it, but that would be permitted in these sorts of conditions on busy streets. That doesn't mean you have to do patios. It could simply be landscaping that you see in here. So it'll be a distance. What's the right amount of distance? So if I'm walking on that sidewalk, you can see, compared to what we saw on the Beach Boulevard distance, it's further away. So that little separation gives you that sort of a distance that people aren't peering into front doors. Another way to do this is with grade separation. And so the idea here is to say, you could do some landscaping, and you raise the grade of the first floor. So we can, by regulation, say in certain instances, an option could be either put landscaping or raise the first floor. And once you do that, you get some wonderful opportunities, like having front doors that are accessed from stoops, as you see in the example on the left side. Another option is actually build that building right up to that property line. Engage it, but raise it. So what you see here is an example. See the woman walking with a dog. By raising that window and the door is high enough that I'd leave my windows open all the time because I know nobody's going to be peering into it. That's a condition that we can do, and that gives the ability for the developer, if they choose to do that, to maximize that development envelope, so we can get more housing. So there are certain conditions that we're going to ask that you have to meet, but we want to give as much flexibility and not dictate one, but here are 3 options that you can do so that the developer and his architect have some ability to use some creativity. Let's talk about site development. Again, that placemat that the building goes onto. And the standards are going to talk about are going to apply to both the mixed use 36 and the mixed use 40 and the R2 through 5 zone lots. These are fairly generic standards. And then here's one area that we talk about: regulate what matters and leave flexibility where we don't. These standards here need to be pretty concise. We do not want to regulate every last inch of the development site, but only the things that matter, okay? And so the other thing that we need to think about is the range of development conditions that you have in the city. So it cannot be a one-size-fits-all, because you have corner lots, you have mid-block lots, you've got lots that are served by alleys. And so we need to take that into consideration as we make site development standards. So some of the things that we do want to think about is off-street parking and regulate the things that matter, like parking access. How many points of access do you get? What's the character of that driveway in consideration of things like fire apparatus, emergency access, and things like that are going to be regulated by others as well. And parking lot and structure location. Where do you put that? Those needed facilities. And then once you've got them, is there a need to screen them? So the standards will look at those sorts of things. So some of the conditions that we want to avoid are affecting the livability. So generally, we don't want to see parking lots between the building and the street, because that creates a condition where people have to walk through parking lots. And frankly, it's just not the kind of condition where you're featuring parking instead of livability of development. The other thing that we want to think about is garage doors. And we'd prefer not to see garage doors on the frontages, because that could be occupied space, and we'd prefer the garage doors to be on the side or the back sides of buildings. And so can this happen? Knowing that we've got some lot conditions, this may be a bit of a challenge. And so this is something that we're looking at standards for, how to do that. And so as we start looking at setbacks and other things like that, we may be able to create a condition where this becomes viable. For example, this site may not have been. So the standards would really generally want to do this. We'd like to see the parking, where you see the arrows, for the parking lots to be to the side or to the rear of the building. Move the building up to the street, put the parking out back behind, so that it doesn't dominate the site. And then once you've got that parking, where you've got it along busy streets or pedestrian routes, add some screening by fences, walls, and landscaping. Could be a combination of those three, but we need to get some so that the car is out back and behind. Well, we'd also then have some standards for the driveway. We want to keep that as narrow as possible while meeting fire access standards, and really encourage things like this, where you have a shared driveway. So this would take this happens to be one single development site, but imagine these two buildings were owned by two different entities. And we'd like to engage those developers as they think about this, to engage their neighbor and say, can we share a driveway? So we have half as much pavement, and we have fewer driveways. So we have fewer crossings, for example, that we saw in the previous standards. We want to think about some just basic standards for landscaping, pavement, lighting, utilities, walls, and fences. And that list will be fairly minor, and I'll just skim over that, but there will be some standards for that talk about the amount of lumens and lights, the types of landscaping that is permitted, and the percentages that will be required on this. So they're pretty standard things, but again, we don't want to do an overkill on these standards. So moving on, this is the last one, so I appreciate your patience as I go through this. So now we talk about the building design. So this one gets pretty tricky, because the one thing we do not want to do is prescribe a certain type of architecture. We want to show you some examples that do show architecture, but we want to distill the fundamental elements of those buildings into standards, so people have a better understanding of what the standards are. We're going to use types of buildings that are pretty common to Westminster. So the standards are going to address building form and scale. Okay, so the form is, think of this as a piece of putty, a piece of clay. We're going to form it, and we're going to scale it. And we're going to form it and scale it two ways, vertically and horizontally. And so the standards are going to really kind of define that kind of forming that we're going to do. So the first thing that we want to talk about is what we call vertical modulation. So in a sense, what we want to do is to make the buildings appear to be in scale with the adjacent neighborhood. So we don't want to have buildings appearing to be out of scale with your community. And you can get buildings of some height if you start thinking about buildings like this, a base, a middle, and a top, and you divide them up so that they have some readability, if you will, between that. So you see an example of how that's done. The other way we want to modulate that building is not only up and down, but in and out. We want the building to project or recess. So you see this example, the building's fairly long. What we'd prefer to see is a building reading as a series of smaller buildings. It's all the same building, but by these projections and recesses, that it feels like three buildings. And that can be reinforced by things like use of color or materials, brick. It could be stucco, it could be metal panel, it could be whatever the developer chooses to do, but we want to have some differentiation so that this reads as smaller horizontal buildings so it doesn't look like a land arc, something that landed and it is not in scale with the development of the area. So this is a standard that we want. And we also don't want to overregulate this. We do want to get to the point where we're getting fussy and requiring things like balconies, requiring a certain size of bays and other things like that. We want bold strokes in that form and the mass of the building. And then it's the discretion of the architect and the developer to determine how they'd add additional articulation. There are going to be some standards in terms of regulating materials, colors, windows, and doors. So this is intended to make sure that the buildings are, one, durable, long-lasting, and also in character with this environment. So those are really the ideas that we want to have with that. So we will have some standards that talk about that. With that, we do know these sorts of things are, have an impact in the developability, you know what I'm saying, the ability to develop a building that could raise costs if we're not careful. So we want to make sure that we're allowing types of finishes that are realistic for affordable housing projects. The standards are also going to look at roof forms, because we want to be able to regulate that. And so we want to see some flexibility, and so that not every building has a flat roof, frankly. And we'd like to see a little bit more creativity and things like maybe sloped roofs. So if that's something you'd like, chime in on that. But we think just a little bit of variation gives the ability to create a little bit more scale that might be more compatible, especially adjacent to residential areas on the corridors. All right, so that's the presentation. If you've got any clarifications, raise your hand. Jonathan over here has got a microphone. He's going to hold it, so if you got a question, raise your hand. And question or clarification, specifically about the ODS and the process.
Hi, I just wonder, can you tell me the actual bill number, if there was one bill that, you know, from the state that said you can no longer do subjective? Is that it?
Yeah, so there's a series of these. So Senate Bill 330, which the housing, the state has required. There's also Senate Bill 35. And those are the two key ones right now. And there's a whole series of other ones like that, and I can talk to you about those afterwards, okay? But those are the two that are regulating right now. And there may be some additional regulation that follows up this summer as well. But those two really are requiring that the ODS and an approval process that is streamlined.
And when did they pass?
The first one's passed in about 2015, 2016. And that's SB 330 and 35 in about 2020, 21 during COVID. So they've been around. And so what they're requiring is every community across California have ODS. So objective standards, guidelines, they're gone. It's not unique to Westminster. As I said, we're working in Newport Beach right now. We're working in Coachella Valley. We're working in other communities around Glendale. I'm doing a lot of them here in California right now. So they're all doing it. Okay.
Do these
Go, Jonathan.
standards have to be, I talk pretty loud. Do these standards have to be presented to anywhere like HCD or somewhere in the state? Do we have to get those standards, once we've adopted them, signed off by any state agency?
Not with this process, no. In the end, the HCD will require that you have ODS, but it's really, it's a bottom-up process that says you craft the ODS that works for Westminster. That doesn't need to look like Newport Beach. You have what you want based on your values and what the local development community needs as well. So it's, yeah, there'll be ODS, but it's really based on how the local community wants it. Not only the ODS, but how you're going to apply them and what the timeline for those development review will be. And that's going to be, those a couple of questions I didn't answer, but that will be more, there will be more clarity on that in the coming months as we get into the rezone project. Okay. And if you have specific questions, I can pull up some more data and things like that and afterwards, and I can show you where you can find that information. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Are these new developments projected to be for rent based on income? That's called affordable housing.
Yeah. So the SB 35, what's called an eligibility form that you need to fill out to use the ODS, does require a level of affordability. And through the rezoning process, that have a little bit more clarity what that datum line of affordability is. There's some guidelines that the state has today that are defined in the SB 35 standard. So and there's some other things that are bonuses that deal with parking, about environmental review, and other things like that that you get if you do an affordable housing project. And so also keep in mind, a developer can opt out of this process. If they don't want to do an ODS project review, they can use the current architectural review process that goes through the Planning Commission or City Council. Yeah, yeah. And may take more time. That's the whole intent of this. It's not to slow the process down, but to accelerate it and get housing going here. Make it easier for everybody. Okay. Yeah. Let's get somebody over here. I saw a hand over here. Somebody held up a hand I saw.
Well, it was not me, but I was going to just throw a question anyway. Your guidelines or your presentation is for large projects on like an acre lots. How about small individual lots?
Yes.
Yeah.
Those include, it applies to everything that is zoned. And there's a zoning map back here if you want to see where your sites are, by the way. It's for the areas that are zoned MU 36 and MU 40 in R2, 3, 4, and 5. And that's today. Now remember, these guys are going to be doing a rezoning process. So that is what is there today. It may change. So you need to be aware of that. That's going to happen over the next few months. And I hope you're engaged in that. If there's certain things that you don't like about your current zoning, that overall zoning process could take a look at, okay? Yeah.
How do you know about that? Like, I
It-
know where I live,
Yeah,
that has been there, like, on Milton Street, the very end, and I was told
yeah. Let's get his question, then I'll come back to you, okay?
I know you had a display earlier with like a single-family home, or I mean a multi-family home with like 4 garage doors, and you say you try to avoid that. We don't want to have that.
Yeah.
How could that be implemented, or how could that be practical if we just have like a small, like a 50 or 60-foot lot, wide lot? How can we have the parking that not facing the front?
Yeah, so that's what the standards are looking at, the real world of understanding what the width of that is, what a driveway width, knowing that you got maybe a 50-foot wide lot. What are the conditions that would not be permitted and what would be permitted? So If it's not physically possible, there may be some standards that say certain dimensions, you're allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that. Okay?
Is there a chance where there are mobile home parks that they may be targeted?
Not with this. Not with this zoning. This is R2, 3, 4, 5, MU 36 and 40 only. This is the only place it applies to, not the mobile home parks. Okay, so that's off limits. That's like single family right now. We're not doing anything with that. Okay?
Okay, then parking. You're going to have families in there. They have birthday, Christmases, and Thanksgivings. They have family and friends that may come over. What are we going to do for additional parking? Is that going to be considered?
So you've got parking standards today. What is ever required in those zones, you would still need to meet those. So that doesn't change any of that standards in terms of parking that's required for units and guests. You need to be consistent with those requirements as they are today. So this standard, the objective development and design standards aren't changing any of that.
Okay, if the standard just calls for each unit, condo or an apartment, to have, say, 2 spaces because 2 cars in that unit, kids grow up, now you're going to have 3 or 4 cars. And like I said, family and friends coming over to visit. It could be a problem in there somewhere.
Yeah, okay. Note that on your paper, and we've got that as a good comment. Thank you very much.
How about open space?
Okay.
Meaning, if there's children, a place for them to simply go out and kick the ball or walk around.
Yeah.
Are we planning on including open space?
Yeah, that's part of the site standards again. There's some current existing regulations, and the character and the use of those standards are part of the ODS. So these are wonderful, wonderful comments. Make sure you get these written down, because these are things that are not set in stone because we're doing a rezone. So if we get enough people who are saying that we want to have certain changes, that can be translated into the zoning update.
I got another one.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, I'm allowed.
You're allowed. Go for
In the
it.
surrounding area, you're going to obviously have residential areas, single-family homes. Depending on the height on these things, are they going to fit in?
That's what the standards are really intended to address, that bulk and mass of the building, and so that you've got some transition from new development to existing development, and there are curtain height standards that are also in place today, so that doesn't change that as well. So write that down again. You're concerned about transitions of height. Okay? All very, very good questions. We appreciate that. Yeah.
You mentioned about the public room with wider parkway and walkway for the people in the neighborhood. For some substandard public room that you guys have, that we have out there, is the city gonna have a fund to dedicated to improve the whole neighborhood, or are we going to just wait for individual developer just to do their own improvement in front of their property?
So there's a couple of ways that could be done. The city could do it and maintain it. It could also be what's called a development agreement, where the developer maintains it and builds it. And all of that kind of detail is going to be worked out over the next few months as the process, the document is adopted. Because we need to talk about, I don't know if you remember, we need to talk to the property owners, we need to talk to the developers, we need to talk to frankly, the public works people as well. So we need to get all those points of view before it's adopted. But again, write that down. It's a very good point of view. Okay, thank you. All right, how about over here? Somebody we haven't heard before we go to anybody else, okay? Who haven't we heard from? Yeah, go ahead. Okay.
Sorry, you're gonna. I just want to understand the zoning process, honestly, because like over where I live, down Milton, I understand at the there's all these mix of everything, and at the very end, there's like a junkyard, I don't know what it is down there, but I understand it's been rezoned. How do we find out when things are gonna be rezoned? Because my concern is, I have Big Lot Shopping Center right in front of where I live, and this scares me.
Yeah, so I think the experts on this is Steve and Allison. I'll let him answer that.
Thank you for your question. Let me see if I can answer it. The city has broken the zoning code update into two parts. Part A was last year. Part B is coming next month. We're going to be working on that. We're going to focus on Part B. We did, as part of Part A, we contacted every property owner. We had stuff on the city's website. We use the city's social media. So if you are a parcel owner in the mixed-use zone, you would have gotten some notification about the rezoning effort. And for this Part B, which includes basically everything except mixed use, because we already took care of mixed use in Part A, we will have additional outreach opportunities. We'll have special workshops. We'll also have different communications to residents, property owners, and others. Similar to what we did in 2016 with the general plan update, where we notified essentially everybody in the city about the effort, because we want everybody's voice to be heard as part of a zoning code update. The zoning code has to work for the residents. It has to work for all of you. When the city adopted the general plan in 2016, it decided that many of the older commercial areas in the city were no longer viable just as commercial properties. They needed to reinvigorate them, so they created 6 mixed-use districts. The idea being that you could have both commercial and housing. The property you mentioned earlier, the old Big Lot site, that is one of those mixed-use properties. And a developer could come in, a property owner, and develop it as mixed use. The idea of the objective design standards, which is a part of the zoning code, is getting quality development standards that would apply. Quality standards that they would have to adhere to if they want to get an expedited review. As Don said, some developers may say, I can't meet your standards. I can't meet them because they're too high. That's fine. Then they'll have to go before the Planning Commission and probably the council. So it's really this ODS process, which is part of the zoning code update, is an effort to get higher quality development in the community, but also allow for better development as envisioned by the general plan, so that we can address the quality of design, and we can also address, in our own way, the housing shortage by providing more housing. One of the comments made earlier was the comment about if ODS applies to affordable housing. Yes, but it also applies to all market rate housing, affordable housing, rental units, and ownership units. So any housing across the board, it would apply to everything. And we know it's been very successful in some other communities. I'd say in this part of Orange County, Westminster's ahead of the game. There's other communities that are still struggling with their objective design standards. So we're very lucky that we're able to start this conversation now, but it's so important that we get all of your comments, we get all the feedback, because we honestly don't know all the answers. We just know that we have an objective. The state's taken away our authority to sort of to evaluate something and decide whether we like it or not. We don't have that ability anymore. So we need to develop objective design standards. So we really appreciate all the comments that everybody's making tonight. Thanks.
Currently on the design guide manual, we have an area in the city that's dedicated to be a certain design.
Yeah.
We're going to continue that theme as far as having a certain, like Old English along Beach Boulevard. Are we going to continue that theme? Or just exclude that?
Yes, thank you, Councilmember Monzo. That's a good question. That is the kind of thing that we need to look at in the ODS. Do we want to have standards that are specific to specific areas? Or do we want to have standards that are basically across the board for different types of areas? But as you know, we're also, after we get past the zoning code update, we're also going to be working on specific plans. Specific plans will give us yet an additional tool to customize development standards for specific areas, such as a civic center, such as Westminster and Beach, such as the downtown. As you know, we've adopted a specific plan for the Westminster Mall. Those have very unique standards just for the mall. They actually have objective design standards in the specific plan. So we'll be able to, through this process, make that decision if we want to have customized standards for specific geographic areas like we used to have in the Design Guidelines Manual, or if we want to wait till the specific plans come and make those custom standards through the specific plan process.
One more question. Recently, I've heard the governor's made a statement as far as reducing some CEQA requirements to streamline. Are we
Yes.
keeping an eye on that CEQA? on
We
what's going on?
are. In fact, we know that there's a number of bills in the legislature, some of which the governor's promoting, that'll be coming out. And the governor's working on something. We don't know if it's going to pass this session, but it would streamline some of the CEQA requirements, especially for affordable projects and infill projects. And it's going to exempt some large-scale projects for reservoirs and other infrastructure. But we also know that the legislature is also working on bills that we anticipate the governor will sign this September, which will further erode the local government's ability to regulate land use. And that's what happened here. We talked about SB 35 and SB 330. Those were really efforts by the state to remove local control over certain land use matters. And SB 35, in our case, only applies when somebody wants to provide 50% or more affordable housing. But SB 330, a more recent bill, is one that also applies to affordable housing and to expediting that production of housing.
I have so many questions, but I'll try to. So is the city going to come up with some proposed detailed standards, and then we can comment and offer changes to those standards? For example, you didn't really cover any detail about the last planning commission meeting, which I think you weren't there. I'm not sure.
I wasn't there.
Okay. But that little project, it was basically in the design that was shown here, where there's a unit in front and then a long driveway and then a unit in back and then the two parking garages in between. But the setback was a discussion because going from 7 feet or whatever it was to 5 feet may not seem like a lot to a developer, to you, but
Yeah.
to the residents next door that are on single story, and the second story is literally, much closer now
Yeah.
to their place. So are you going to come up with proposed, let's say, setbacks that will, and also do the specific plans override these general ODS standards?
Let me answer the first question. The answer to the first question is yes. What we're hoping to do tonight, and then we're going to have another workshop on the 17th of June. Is that correct? We'll have another workshop on 17th. Before we flesh out the draft ODS, we want to get comments because I want to make sure that this draft reflects the needs of the community. And then we are going to, at some point, release a draft. We don't know specifically when yet because we've got to incorporate these into the first part of the zoning code update. But we will be releasing a draft, and we're hoping that everyone here tonight and anyone else who attends the workshops or is watching this on YouTube or watching the streaming will comment on the draft when it's released. So it's just the beginning of a process. The second question, I believe, was whether the specific plans would override it. They could. A specific plan can override the standards, or let's say the standards below it, or it can be in conjunction with. So, and it depends upon the specific plan. Some specific plans just simply say, forget about what the zoning code says, follow what's in the specific plan. And then some specific plans are written that say, okay, everything in the zoning code's still valid, but here's some additional requirements. The mall pretty much wiped out the zoning code and said, this is the zoning for the mall. Yeah.
Who's going to approve these standards? Will it be the planning commission and the city council?
The ODS? Yes, absolutely. Everything that we're talking about tonight has to be adopted through ordinance. So this would after we go through all the workshops, community meetings, an opportunity for the public to review the draft, there will eventually be a public hearing before the Planning Commission and then another one before the City Council. It has to be adopted by ordinance. So this is nothing that any of us in the staff level have any authority to do.
I have one last question. I'm so sorry. I talk loud enough, I know, but I know on the video. A big question is, in some ways, this is taking away some transparency. And I say that only because we're already having issues as a community, and you know how many times I have requested the city issue a monthly active permit, active development project summary, like other cities do very easily on a regular basis. Thus far, we've not done that. Now you're going to have all these, could be large projects, not going before the Planning Commission, which is public, or appealing to the City Council. It's going to all be handled internally by staff. So we, the public, won't have an opportunity to even review or weigh in on individual projects that go through this process if the developer chooses to go with our objective standards. So I think it's kind of going away from transparency, and the city is going to have to work much harder on making development information that's ongoing public, on a updated at least monthly. And I'm going to keep squeaking about that, because this is taking away the Planning Commission process for some, could be very large projects.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, we appreciate that comment. I would just say, could you please write that down, because we want to make sure that gets incorporated into all the comments here tonight.
I got a question, but kind of a follow-up on some of Terry's, and that last one was an excellent point. I fully, piques my interest in what she just said on that. Well, my comment would be on the skepticism that I have, and other people I'm sure have to have too, is when you're setting guidelines, when you're setting rules, why are they not adhered to? Because there are so many Planning Commission meetings and so many of these other public meetings that these developers and whoever comes in and wants variances.
Right.
Stop with the variances, or you have to have a second set of rules for the variances on how far they go. Because that last planning meeting, when that property owner wanted 2 feet, one of the commissioners wanted to negotiate to 6. He was asking from 7 to 5.
Yeah.
He wanted 2 more feet. And it really wasn't even, I don't think it was in writing or really verbally specified that he was going to do the entire length of the building, or was it only the center section where the garages were? So that was vague. So you have to set some firm guidelines, and then you have to set another set of guidelines firmly for the variances, because you just go to variance and variance and variance. What good is the rules in the first place?
Well, it's a very good question and a good comment. What I would say is that you're right. Definitely, objective design standards become the law when they're adopted. It's up to the city to make sure, and by city I mean it's up to the Planning Commission and Council to weigh carefully whether a variance is necessary or not. But what I think is important for this process to keep in mind is that one of the big attractions of objective design standards that would keep people from requesting a variance in the first place is a carrot and stick approach. The carrot for the developer is a streamlined process. So they're going to follow the requirements because they want to get through the process quicker. There will be a few, of course, that would probably say, I can't meet, the city of Westminster has all these high standards, I can't meet it, I need a variance. Well, then it goes to the Planning Commission, just like it does today. The difference is that once we adopt the objective design standards, we'll have much higher quality standards to hold people's feet to the fire. But ultimately, it is up to the Planning Commission to decide whether a variance is warranted or not. And please write your comment down, because that's a good one.
Can we type, or if we come to the second meeting, can we type these in? Or
Yeah, absolutely.
that we can go, it's much easier than writing it out by hand.
Absolutely. And if you want, just email them to us. We would appreciate that too, if you'd prefer to email them. Yeah, send it to myself or to Alice.
I'll
Anybody else hasn't said anything?
It's only for new development.
That's correct.
Yes, it does not apply to single-family homes,
Okay.
does not apply to existing.
But Steve, understand Westminster, I'm sure you do. East side is different from west side, are these standards, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. No, we do, and I know a lot of what you're speaking about was addressed in the general plan in 2016. The idea to get higher quality development in the city, to reinvigorate some of our old, how should I say it, rundown areas, and to bring value to property owners, yourself and others, to see your property values increased by better quality development in the city. It's not going to be an easy task. I mean, the crossings, for example, is a good example where our staff worked really hard to push that affordable architect to come up with a high-quality design that could set the pace for future mixed-use development on the corridor. And we have interest in other properties along the corridor to do something similar. What we need to do next is to adopt these type of standards, high-quality standards that allow those developers to come in, go through a relatively easier process, but at the end of the day, the community benefits by higher quality development. And we hope that's how we're going to help address some of the issues that we have with some of the older, rundown areas of the city that we can improve.
It would be helpful for us just to have a sense of, if anybody's willing, a little show of hands, so I get a better sense of who's here tonight. If you're a resident, can you just raise your hand so I have a better sense of that? People who are residents. Okay, just general count, that's pretty good. How about developers, people who are going to develop property? So we've got some of that, so that's good to see. How about design professionals, planners who are working with developers? Okay, architects, yeah, okay, awesome. So we got a really good mix, and it's really helpful to get a sense of that. So we're not talking to just one group here, and I think it's really helpful for everybody to hear all voices and respond to that. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it'll be helpful too when you guys write your comment card if you guys could note that too, if you're a developer, or designer, or homeowner.
Is the public able to go to that workshop for the stakeholders?
Absolutely.
I'll say it again, is the public allowed to go to the stakeholder meeting? Now I'm getting a yes and a no, so let's.
We want to give them an ability to talk specifically about their own parcel and their own.
No.
It's not that we don't want to have the public, that's why we're having another Saturday meeting. That if I own a piece of parcel land and I'm considering developing it, it may have some information that I'm not ready to talk to in the public. And so we want to reserve some time for people to, because the standards are going to impact those specific parcels, to have an opportunity to chime in. So there's nothing underhanded or backroom deal on it. We just need to make sure that we're listening to all voices. So, and that information will be passed on with their consent at some point too. So it won't be above the entire, truthfully, what the reason we want to do that.
Will
Okay?
the comments received from the public and the developers be memorialized somehow in the zoning update, like they do for other projects, you know, the EIR or whatever? You have the comments of who submitted the comment, what their comment was, and then the response. Is there something like that process?
That I don't know. I don't know.
Not in this process, but I think we want to be able to do at least, we need to summarize those comments and put it in a format that's understandable. If we heard comments about a certain subject or concern, we heard this 5 times, and here are the people who made the comments. We'll give it in, just write it out and verbatim what we heard from your comment lists. So that's why it's really important to write this down, because we'll translate that into the findings of this process. Okay, write it down.
I would like to
Write
know.
it down.
I will, but I would really like to be present to hear what kind of concerns the developers have as well, because.
Well, that's why we're trying to invite them to the public meeting today. So ask
Come
them.
to ours
what are
so
their
we can go to theirs.
Yeah. Okay.
Right, guys?
All right, so here's the key thing, too. Fill these out. If you need another day, you want to take an extra one, hand it to a friend, take a couple more, because more comments, the better. All right, so this isn't just one-time shot, but we do need it in a certain amount of time. Get it back in a week, not 3 weeks out here, but get it back, and then make the meeting on the 23rd. Invite a couple more people who you know. The more people we get, the better this process will be. All right?
And we definitely hope all of you can attend our next workshop on the 17th. It's going to be on a Saturday. We hope that we would ask that all of you stay engaged with us. Please help us, because we can't get through this process without your comments and your help. Well, thank you. Thank you for coming tonight, too. I think we're done.
We'll be around for another 40 minutes or so, too, so don't, if you